Chicago Mercy Hospital 2:15 a.m. during the worst storm of the year. Save him in 10 minutes or I start shooting. The gunman aimed at Dr. Clara Vance Hart as the wounded mafia boss collapsed onto her operating table, blood flooding his ruined suit. Clara's face went pale but her hands never trembled. "Put the gun down," she said coldly. "In my emergency room, your boss's life is worth no more than anyone else's." Julian Thorne's storm-gray eyes opened. "Careful, doctor," he rasped. "Men have died for speaking to me that way." Hours later, Clara opened her locker and found a blood-stained $100 bill beside a polished bullet casing. Then her apartment door exploded inward. "Get dressed," the scarred gunman growled. "Julian is dying and you coming with us." But Clara had no idea that saving the mafia boss would expose 40 imprisoned women and place her own sister in the hands of his deadliest enemy. How far would a doctor go to save a monster who might be the only man capable of stopping something far worse? Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and let the story begin. The Chicago Mercy Hospital emergency room was loud. It always was. It was a chaotic mix of crying children, drunk drivers, and exhausted nurses. Clara Vance wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead. She was 32 years old. She ran on cold cafeteria coffee and pure, stubborn willpower. She stood elbow-deep in a shattered rib cage in Trauma Bay 1. The patient was a homeless man who had been hit by a delivery truck. His pulse was fading fast. The machine beside him beeped a frantic, desperate warning. Clara didn't care about his bank account or his lack of an address. She only cared about the failing rhythm of his heart. She reached in with her forceps and clamped a severed blood vessel. Then the noise stopped. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was instant. The heavy automatic doors of the ambulance bay didn't just slide open. They blew off their tracks. A massive crash echoed across the sterile linoleum. Clara looked up. Her hands were still inside her patient's chest. 3 men walked through the shattered entrance. They didn't look like patients. They wore tailored dark suits. The kind of clothes that cost more than Clara's entire medical school debt. Rain dripped heavily from their broad shoulders, pooling on the clean floor. The man in the middle was huge, but his legs were giving out. His head hung low, chin resting on his chest. A thick, gruesome trail of dark blood followed him. He was bleeding out fast. The man on the right stepped forward. He had cold eyes and a heavily scarred jaw. He didn't yell for a doctor. He didn't ask for help. He simply reached under his wet jacket and pulled out a Glock 19. He pointed the black barrel straight at the ceiling. "We need a doctor right now." Nurses scattered. The few patients in the waiting room dove to the floor. Clara didn't drop her instruments. She finished tying off the vein in the homeless man's chest. She looked calmly at her scrub nurse. "Keep applying pressure. Keep him stable." She stepped away from the operating table. She pulled off her bloody latex gloves and threw them in a bin. She snapped on a fresh pair. Then she walked right up to the man with the gun. "Put that away," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake at all. "You are scaring my patients." The man, Marcus, though she didn't know his name yet, lowered the gun. He pointed it directly at her chest. "Drop what you're doing. Fix him," Marcus ordered. "You have 10 minutes, or I start shooting." Clara didn't flinch. She looked past the gun. She looked at the bleeding man supported between the 2 guards, Julian Thorne. He was pale, his skin was slick with cold sweat, but his eyes were open. They were piercing, stormy gray eyes, and they locked onto hers. "I don't care about your gun," Clara said flatly, her voice carrying across the silent room. "And I don't care who you think you are. In this room, everyone is equal. It doesn't matter if you're a king, a criminal, or the man I just saved on that table. A human life is a human life. Your bullets don't make his heartbeat more important than anyone else's." Marcus tightened his grip on the weapon. He looked ready to pull the trigger. Julian's gave a tiny, almost invisible shake of his head. He looked at Clara. He respected her fire. "Bring him to Trauma Bay 2. Clara ordered now. They hauled Julian onto the empty gurney. The harsh fluorescent lights hit his face for the first time. He was striking. He had a sharp, aristocratic jawline and a dark shadow of stubble. His bespoke suit was ruined by a massive red stain spreading across his right abdomen. Clara grabbed a pair of trauma shears. She cut right through the expensive fabric of his shirt. The bullet wound was ugly. It sat low on his right side. Dark blood pulsed out in a steady, terrifying rhythm. "You want a 10-minute fix?" Clara asked, looking over her shoulder at Marcus. She grabbed a thick stack of sterile gauze. That only happens in movies. She leaned her entire body weight onto his wound. Julian let out a low, guttural groan. The pain must have been blinding. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapped around Clara's wrist like a steel vise. "Look at me," Clara commanded. Julian's gray eyes snapped up to her face. The storm in them was wild and completely feral. He looked like an apex predator backed into a corner. "You have a ruptured artery," Clara told him, keeping her voice low and calm. "I am in a non-sterile room. If I dig around in your stomach to stitch that artery right now, you will die of a massive bacterial infection by tomorrow morning. I am going to pack the wound. I am going to stop the bleeding. Then you are going up to a real operating room. No hospitals," rasped. His voice was a dark, gravelly rumble that vibrated in her chest. "You are already in one," Clara shot back. "No records." Marcus stepped closer. The gun was still raised. Clara glared at the bodyguard. "My job is to preserve human life. Period. What you do after I stop the bleeding is your problem. Now step back and let me work." She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed a roll of combat gauze. It was laced with a chemical clotting agent. It was designed to burn and coagulate blood on contact. "This is going to hurt," she warned. She shoved the gauze directly into the open bullet hole. Julian didn't insult. His jaw locked so tight, Clara thought his teeth might shatter. The muscles in his neck strained. But he didn't look away from her. His grip on her wrist shifted. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was an anchor. He was using the steady rhythm of her pulse to stay conscious. Through the blinding haze of pain, his eyes drifted down to her chest, to the laminated plastic badge clipped to her scrubs. "Dr. Clara Vance," he read it. He memorized it. He locked it away in his mind. Clara worked fast. Her hands were a blur of practiced motion. She wrapped his torso in heavy pressure bandages. She hooked an IV needle into his arm and hung a bag of saline to replace his lost fluids. The bleeding slowed. The cardiac monitor showed his heart rate finally stabilizing. "He needs surgery," Clara told Marcus as she stepped back. "Real surgery in a sterile field. If he walks out that door, he will tear the blood clot. He will bleed out in the street." Marcus didn't answer. He just looked at Julian. Julian nodded. Marcus and the third man grabbed Julian's arms. They pulled him roughly off the gurney. The heart monitor wires ripped off his chest. The machine flatlined with a sharp, continuous warning tone. "What are you doing?" Clara yelled. She stepped forward to grab his arm. "He's going," paused. He leaned heavily against Marcus. He turned his head slowly and looked at Clara one last time. "Thank you, Dr. Vance," he whispered. They walked out into the rain, just like that. The shattered doors swung loosely in the wind. The ear was dead silent again. Clara stood completely alone in the trauma bay. Her hands were coated in his blood. She had just treated a ghost. Hours passed. The adrenaline finally crashed, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. The morning shift arrived as the sun came up over Chicago. Clara gave her medical report. She didn't mention the men in the suits. She didn't mention the gun. She just noted a walk-in gunshot victim who fled against medical advice. Her whole body ached. Her shift was finally over. She walked into the empty staff locker room. The air smelled of cheap bleach and stale coffee. She dragged her feet to her locker. Locker number 42. She spun the combination dial. She pulled the metal door open. She reached for her civilian clothes. Her hand froze in mid-air. Sitting right in the center of her folded wool sweater was a crisp $100 bill. It was stained with a dark, perfect thumbprint of fresh blood. Right next to it sat a single, polished 9mm shell casing. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They had bypassed hospital security. They had walked right past the front desk. They had found her exact locker. They knew exactly who she was and where to find her. It wasn't a simple thank you. It was a promise. The rain fell hard. It hit the bedroom window like thrown gravel. Clara lay in the dark. She stared at the ceiling. She was exhausted. Her bones ached. Her muscles burned. But her mind refused to shut down. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blood. She saw the man with the gray eyes. She saw the bullet casing sitting in her locker. It was 3:14 a.m. The silence in the apartment was heavy. It felt thick. It felt wrong. Then came the sound. A massive, violent crash. The deadbolt on her front door didn't just break. It exploded. Wood splintered. Metal screamed. The heavy door slammed into the hallway wall. Clara shot up in bed. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She threw off the blankets. Her bare feet hit the cold floor. She reached for the heavy brass lamp on her nightstand. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. Heavy footsteps echoed in the living room, boots on hardwood. Fast, purposeful. A flashlight beam swept across her bedroom wall. Clear, a rough voice said. A dark figure filled her bedroom doorway. It was Marcus, from the emergency room. His suit was gone. He wore a dark tactical jacket. Water dripped from his shoulders. He didn't hold a gun this time. He didn't need to. The sheer size of him was a threat. Get dressed, Marcus ordered. Clara gripped the brass lamp. Her knuckles turned white. Get out of my house. I will call the police. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't even blink. The police won't come. We own the dispatcher on this block. Put your shoes on. We are leaving. No, Clara stood her ground. Her voice shook, but she forced the word out. You don't own me. You don't get to kick down my door and take my life. A person is not property. Marcus stepped into the room. He moved with terrifying speed. He ripped the lamp out of her hands. He tossed it onto the bed. It landed with a soft thud. Julian is dying, Marcus said. The coldness in his voice cracked. Just for a second, his fever is spiking. The wound is infected. You are going to fix him. Take him to a hospital, Clara yelled. I can't, Marcus snapped. If he goes to a hospital, the men who shot him will find him. They will kill him, and they will kill you for treating him the first time. Clara froze. The air in the room felt suddenly freezing. You dragged me into this, she whispered. You did your job, Marcus replied. Now do it again. Grab your medical bag. You have 1 minute, or I carry you over my shoulder in your pajamas. Clara had no choice. She was trapped. She shoved her feet into a pair of boots. She grabbed a thick coat. She slung her heavy trauma bag over her shoulder. Marcus grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising. He pulled her down the stairs. A black armored SUV sat idling at the curb. The rain washed over its dark windows. Marcus shoved her into the back seat. The doors locked with a heavy, final sound. They drove in silence. They left the city limits. They headed deep into the northern suburbs. The roads turned dark. Trees swallowed the streetlights. Clara stared out the window. Her freedom was gone. It was a fundamental violation. Human beings have a right to autonomy. They have a right to safety. These men cared for nothing but their own survival. The SUV turned onto a private, winding driveway. Massive iron gates swung open. They parked beneath the stone portico of a sprawling estate. It looked like a fortress. Marcus hauled her out of the car. He led her down a set of stone stairs. Deep underground, the air changed. It smelled of bleach and damp concrete. They entered a massive room. It was an underground medical bunker. It had a hospital bed. It had heart monitors. It had glass cabinets full of drugs. But it wasn't sterile. It wasn't safe. Julian lay on the bed. He looked terrible. His skin was the color of ash. Sweat poured down his face. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. The thick bandages Clara had applied hours ago were soaked through with dark, foul-smelling fluid. Fix him, Marcus demanded. He stepped back and crossed his arms. Clara dropped her bag. Her anger vanished. Her medical training took over. She walked to the bed. She placed her hand on Julian's forehead. He was burning up. He is in septic shock, Clara said. Her voice was clinical, sharp. The bullet must have nicked his bowel. Bacteria is flooding his bloodstream. His organs are starting to shut down. So stop it, Marcus growled. I need antibiotics, Clara ordered. She didn't look at Marcus. She pointed to the glass cabinets. Zosyn, bags of normal saline meat. Now move, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't used to taking orders. I am the doctor, Clara shouted. She spun around. She glared at the giant man. You brought me here to save his life. You stripped me of my rights. You forced me into a cage. If you want him to breathe, you will respect my authority in this room. Fetch the drugs. Marcus clenched his jaw. He went to the cabinet. He pulled the glass vials. Clara went to work. It was brutal. It was unanesthetized field surgery. She pushed massive doses of antibiotics into Julian's veins. She squeezed bags of saline to force his crashing blood pressure back up. She had to open the wound. She peeled the tape back. The smell of infection hit the air. It was sharp and rotting. She cleaned the torn muscle. She flushed the wound with sterile water. Julian thrashed. The fever made him delirious. He fought invisible enemies. Hold him down, Clara yelled. Marcus grabbed Julian's shoulders. He pinned the mafia boss to the mattress. Clara packed the clean wound. She tied the sutures. Her hands were covered in his blood. Again, for 3 hours it was a war. Clara fought microscopic bacteria with every tool she had. She refused to let him die. Not because he was a kingpin, but because he was a human being on her table. All life has value, even a life soaked in violence. She believed that. She had to believe that. Slowly, the fever broke. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor slowed into a steady rhythm. Julian's breathing deepened. The ashen color left his skin. Clara slumped onto a metal stool. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was drained. Marcus let out a long, heavy exhale. He stepped back from the bed. "He is stable for now," Clara said softly. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her. There was a glimmer of respect in his cold eyes. He nodded once, then he turned and walked out of the bunker. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him. Clara sat alone in the quiet room. She watched Julian breathe. Suddenly, Julian's hand moved. His fingers twitched. He let out a rough, ragged breath. His gray eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, unfocused. He turned his head slowly. He looked at Clara sitting beside the bed. He didn't look like a killer in that moment. He looked entirely broken. He reached his hand across the white sheets. His fingers weakly brushed against her arm. "Clara," he whispered. His voice was nothing but dry air. She leaned closer. She checked his pulse. "You are safe. The infection is clearing." Julian shook his head, a tiny, desperate movement. He grabbed her sleeve. His grip was weak, but his eyes were suddenly burning with intensity. "No," he rasped. "Not safe. If I die tonight, the women. Trapped in the shipyard, they die with me." Her blood ran cold. Julian's eyes rolled back. The exhaustion pulled him under. He passed out completely. Clara stared at the sleeping man, the monster she had just saved. The room felt smaller, the air grew thin. She realized with terrifying clarity that she wasn't just fighting for his life. She was fighting a war she didn't even understand. Clara woke up. The bed was incredibly soft. The sheets smelled of expensive lavender and fresh linen. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was a masterpiece. It was a hand-painted fresco of a stormy sky. It was beautiful. It was also a cage. Clara sat up quickly. Panic flared in her chest. She wore a pair of soft silk pajamas. Someone had changed her clothes while she slept from exhaustion. The violation made her skin crawl. She swung her legs over the edge of the massive four-poster bed. She walked to the heavy oak door. She grabbed the brass handle. She pulled. It didn't move. The deadbolt was locked from the outside. "Hey," Clara shouted. She banged her fists against the thick wood. "Open the door. You have no right." Silence answered her. She turned around. The bedroom was the size of her entire apartment. It had a marble fireplace. It had a private balcony, but the balcony doors were locked tight. The glass was thick, probably bulletproof. A silver tray sat on a glass table near the window. It held a pot of hot coffee, fresh fruit, and a folded set of dark clothes. Clara ignored the food. She marched into the adjoining bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face. She stared at herself in the gold-rimmed mirror. She looked pale, but her eyes were sharp. She was not going to be a victim. She was a surgeon. She knew how to cut. She knew how to survive. She stripped off the silk pajamas. She put on the clothes from the tray. They were a pair of dark slacks and a heavy cashmere sweater. They fit perfectly. That terrified her. They knew her sizes. An hour later, the heavy deadbolt clicked. The door opened. Marcus stood in the hallway. "He wants to see you," Marcus said. Clara lifted her chin. She walked past the giant guard without a word. Marcus led her through a maze of sweeping corridors. The estate was breathtaking. Oil paintings lined the walls. Antique rugs covered the hardwood floors. It was wealth built on blood. They reached a set of massive walnut double doors. Marcus opened them. He stepped aside. Clara walked in. It was a vast library. Thousands of books climbed the walls. A roaring fire burned in a massive stone hearth. Julian sat behind a heavy oak desk. He was out of bed. He shouldn't have been out of bed. He wore dark slacks and a loose, unbuttoned shirt. The thick white bandages wrapped around his torso were visible. He looked pale, but the lethal, predatory energy he radiated was back. He was holding a crystal glass of water. He looked up as Clara entered. "Dr. Vance," Julian said. His voice was a low rumble. "Please, sit." He gestured to a leather chair across from him. Clara remained standing. She crossed her arms. "I prefer to stand. And I prefer you unlock the front gate so I can go home." Julian set his glass down. He leaned back in his chair. He winced slightly as the movement pulled his stitches. "You know I cannot do that." "You can," Clara fired back. Her voice was sharp. It echoed in the large room. "You choose not to, because you believe your survival is more important than my freedom. You stole my body, my time, and my life. You are a hypocrite." Julian's eyes narrowed. "A hypocrite." "Yes." Clara took a step toward the desk. She wasn't backing down. "You have people guarding you. You demand respect, but you give none. Human dignity is not a sliding scale, Mr. Thorne. It is absolute. You do not get to treat people like tools just because you hold a gun." Julian stared at her. The silence stretched. The fire crackled in the hearth. He wasn't used to people speaking to him this way. People usually begged. People usually cried. Clara just demanded her rights as a human being. "You are right," Julian said softly. Clara blinked. She hadn't expected that. "I am a monster," Julian continued. His gray eyes were unreadable. "I am a necessary evil in a world that you do not understand. But I did not bring you here just to save my own skin." "Then why?" Clara demanded. "Because my Uncle Silas wants me dead," Julian said. He leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the desk. "Silas ordered the hit at the hospital. He paid off my own men, family drama." "How tragic," Clara said dryly. "Don't kidnap a surgeon." Julian ignored her sarcasm. "Silas ordered the hit because I gave an order he did not like. I ordered the permanent shutdown of the syndicate's human trafficking routes." The room went entirely still. Clara stopped breathing. She remembered his feverish whisper. "The women in the shipyard. My father built this empire on dirty money." Julian, his voice was cold. It lacked all emotion, but his eyes betrayed a deep, buried rage, extortion, and people. "He treated human beings exactly as you accused me of treating you. Like tools." Julian paused. He looked down at his bandaged side. "When I took over," Julian said, "I started burning the roots. I started killing the buyers. I am trying to drag my family into legitimate business. Silas didn't want to lose the profit. So he put a bullet in me." Clara stared at the mafia boss. Her mind raced. The world was spinning. He wasn't a hero. He killed people. He was a criminal, but he was fighting a war to stop something infinitely worse. "You told me in the bunker." Clara whispered, "You said if you die, the women in the shipyard die. Silas has a shipment coming in." Julian confirmed. He looked back up at her. 40 women, undocumented, desperate. Silas plans to sell them to an overseas cartel. If I am dead, Silas takes control of the syndicate. The sale goes through. Those women vanish forever. Clara felt sick. The sheer scale of the evil crushed her chest. "I need to live long enough to stop him," Julian said. "That is why you are here. Clara, your medical oath demands you preserve life. I am asking you to keep me breathing so I can preserve theirs." It was a massive, crushing weight. He wasn't asking for her help. He was holding her morality hostage. Before Clara could answer, a heavy knock echoed on the library door. Marcus stepped in. "Boss, we have a breach on the west perimeter. I need you to look at the security feed." Julian sighed. He stood up slowly. He gripped the edge of the desk for support. "Wait here, Dr. Vance. Do not leave this room." He walked past her. Marcus followed him out. The heavy doors clicked shut. Clara was alone, her heart hammered. She paced the room. She felt trapped in a nightmare. She walked past Julian's massive desk. Something caught her eye. A large blueprint lay unrolled on the polished wood. It was held down by a heavy crystal ashtray. Clara stepped closer. She looked at the blue ink. It was a schematic of the Chicago shipping yards. Sector 4, a specific shipping container, was circled in thick red marker. Notes were scribbled in the margins. 40 units, arrival Friday night. Transfer at midnight. They weren't units. They were people. They were women, mothers, daughters. Stripped of their dignity, stripped of their human rights, packed into a metal box in the freezing cold. Clara traced the red circle with her trembling finger. Julian's war wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was real. It was happening right now. And she was standing in the middle of it. She couldn't just sit here. She couldn't trust a mafia boss to play savior. She had to get to the police. She had to expose Sector 4. She had to do it herself. She turned away from the desk. She needed a way out. Clara studied the cage. That was the first rule of survival. Know the limits of your prison. For 2 days she played the obedient doctor. She checked Julian's vitals. She changed his dressings. She ate the meals brought to her room, but she watched. She watched the guards. She watched the patrols. She watched the blinking red lights of the security cameras mounted on the estate walls. She noticed a pattern every night. At exactly 2:00 a.m. the guards changed shifts, for exactly 30 seconds. The camera on the east garden wall panned away to sweep the main driveway. It created a blind spot, a tiny, fleeting window of opportunity. It was a desperate gamble. But staying meant trusting Julian, trusting a killer. She couldn't do that. She had to get to the real authorities. She had to tell them about Sector 4. At 1:55 a.m. Clara slipped out of her bedroom window. She climbed down the thick ivy trellis, clinging to the stone wall. The rain was pouring again. It was freezing. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She hit the muddy ground. She stayed low. She crept through the manicured bushes. She reached the base of the east garden wall. She pressed her back against the cold stone. She looked up. The camera was pointing directly at her. The red light blinked in the dark. She counted the seconds in her head. Her pulse roared in her ears. 1:59 a.m. The camera whirred softly. It rotated away. It pointed toward the driveway. Clara moved. She didn't hesitate. She leaped up. She grabbed the top edge of the stone wall. The rough rock tore the skin on her palms. She ignored the pain. She hauled herself up. She threw her leg over the top. She dropped down the other side. She landed hard in a thick patch of wet ferns. She scrambled to her feet. She ran blindly into the dark woods surrounding the estate. Branches whipped her face. Thorns tore her clothes. Mud sucked at her boots. She didn't stop. She ran until her lungs burned. She ran until her legs felt like lead. Finally, she saw lights, a lonely, two-lane highway cut through the trees. A small, rundown diner sat on the edge of the road. Its neon signs buzzed weakly in the rain. Clara stumbled out of the woods. She was covered in mud and blood. She pushed through the diner doors. The bell jingled. An old waitress behind the counter gasped. "Honey, are you okay, payphone?" Clara gasped. She leaned against a booth. "Please. I need a phone." The waitress pointed to the back hallway. Clara practically crawled to the phone. Her hands shook violently. She picked up the receiver. She didn't dial 911. The police in this area might be on Julian's payroll. Marcus had said they owned the dispatchers. She needed someone completely outside this world. Someone with authority. Someone she trusted with her life. She dialed a memorized number. The phone rang 3 times. "Hello," a groggy voice answered. "Dr. Pendleton," Clara choked out. Tears of relief finally spilled down her cheeks. "Arthur, it's Clara." Dr. Arthur Pendleton was the chief of surgery at Mercy Hospital. He had mentored Clara since her residency. He was like a father to her, a pillar of the medical community. A good, honest man, Clara. Arthur sounded shocked. He woke up immediately. "Where are you? You missed 2 shifts. We thought you were dead. The police are looking for you." Clara sobbed quietly. "Arthur, I escaped. I'm at a diner on Route 41, near the Forest Preserve. Please, you have to come get me. You have to take me to the FBI field office downtown. There's a trafficking ring. Silas Thorne, I have proof. Stay exactly where you are." Arthur said. His voice was firm, reassuring. "Don't talk to anyone. I am leaving right now. I'll be there in 30 minutes. "Hurry," Clara whispered. She hung up the phone. She slid down the wall. She sat on the dirty diner floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees. She felt safe for the first time in days. She felt the crushing weight lift off her chest. She had beaten the monsters. 35 minutes later, a silver Mercedes pulled into the diner parking lot. Clara rushed out the door. The rain was still falling. Arthur Pendleton stepped out of the driver's side. He wore a heavy trench coat. He looked older, but he smiled when he saw her. "Claire," he breathed. He rushed forward. He wrapped his arms around her. Clara hugged him back. She let out a long, shuddering breath. "Arthur, thank God. Let's go. We have to go straight to the feds." "Get in the car," Arthur said gently. He opened the passenger door for her. Clara climbed into the heated leather seat. It felt like heaven. Arthur got behind the wheel. He locked the doors. He put the car in drive. They drove back toward the city. The dark woods faded. The bright city lights appeared on the horizon, the glowing skyline of Chicago. Clara closed her eyes. The legal, safe world was waiting for her. "You did good, Clara," Arthur said quietly. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight. "You survived." Clara opened her eyes. She looked out the window. Something was wrong. They weren't taking the expressway toward the federal building. Arthur took a sharp exit. He drove into an industrial district. The streetlights here were shattered. Abandoned warehouses loomed in the dark. "Arthur," Clara said. Her voice trembled. "Where are we going?" "The FBI office is downtown." Arthur didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "Arthur," Clara yelled. He pulled the Mercedes into a dark, dead-end alleyway. He threw the car in park. 2 black vans sat idling in the alley. Their headlights snapped on. They blinded Clara. Men stepped out of the vans. They wore heavy tactical gear. They carried assault rifles. They weren't police. They weren't FBI. Clara's stomach dropped out of her body. The world tilted on its axis. "What did you do?" Clara whispered. She looked at her mentor. Her hero. Arthur finally turned his head. His eyes were filled with tears. But they were also filled with terrible, pathetic cowardice. "I'm sorry, Clara," Arthur choked out. His voice broke. "The gambling debts. I owe Silas Thorne $2 million. They were going to kill my family. They were going to break my hands. I couldn't operate anymore. You sold me, Clara said. The reality crushed her completely. It shattered her entire worldview. He said he just wanted to talk to you. Arthur pleaded weakly. He said he wouldn't hurt you. He is a trafficker, Clara screamed. She slammed her fists against the locked window. He sells human beings and you just sold me to him. The legal safe world didn't exist. It was an illusion. The light was just as rotten as the dark. It was all a lie. A heavy fist banged on the passenger window. Clara screamed. A man in a tactical mask shattered the glass with the butt of his rifle. He reached in, he grabbed Clara by her coat. He hauled her violently out of the car. Clara kicked, she scratched. She fought with the fury of a dying animal. But the men were too strong. They dragged her across the wet pavement toward the open doors of the black van. This was the end. Silas Thorne was going to torture her to find Julian. Then he was going to kill her. The 40 women in the shipping containers were going to vanish. Evil had won. The men threw Clara into the back of the van. The cold metal floor hit her ribs. The driver climbed into the front seat. He reached for the ignition. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the engine to start. A sharp, distinct crack echoed in the alley. It wasn't a pistol, it was the high-velocity snap of a suppressed sniper rifle. The windshield of the van shattered inward in a spray of safety glass. The driver didn't scream. His head snapped back, he slumped forward over the steering wheel. The horn blared, a loud, continuous wail in the dark. Clara gasped. She opened her eyes. The alley descended into absolute chaos. The alley descended into absolute chaos. The van's horn blared continuously. The dead driver was slumped over the steering wheel. The blaring noise echoed off the brick walls. It was deafening. The mercenaries panicked. They raised their rifles. They scanned the rooftops. They scanned the fire escapes. They expected a SWAT team. They expected an army. They got one man. A shadow detached itself from the brick wall near the alley entrance. There was no loud gunfire. There were no battle cries. There was only a terrifying, rhythmic clicking sound. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The suppressed shots were clinically precise. The mercenary closest to the van dropped. A bullet caught him right under the rim of his tactical helmet. He hit the wet pavement without a sound. The second guard swung his rifle. He fired wildly into the dark. Sparks flew from a dumpster. Bricks shattered. Another suppressed shot rang out. The second guard fell backward. His rifle clattered to the ground. Clara stayed flat on the floor of the van. She covered her head with her arms. The smell of copper and gunpowder filled the tight space. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The firing stopped. The alley went dead silent, except for the wailing horn and the driving rain. Footsteps approached the van. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for Silas. She waited for the end. A hand grabbed the collar of her coat. It pulled her up. Clara screamed and kicked. She lashed out blindly. Stop. A rough voice growled. Clara froze. She opened her eyes. Julian Thorne stood over her. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a black tactical sweater. It was soaked with rain. His face was pale, exhausted, but his gray eyes were locked onto hers. They were fierce. They were burning. Are you hurt? Julian asked. His breath came in shallow rasps. Clara shook her head. She couldn't speak. Julian reached down. He hauled her out of the van. He pulled her flush against his chest. His free hand held a sleek black pistol. He kept it raised, scanning the dark alley. Clara looked past his shoulder. Arthur Pendleton was on his knees by his Mercedes. The chief of surgery was weeping. He held his hands in the air. He begged for his life. Julian didn't even look at the man. Leave him, Julian ordered. He didn't waste a bullet on a coward. He didn't care about Arthur. He only cared about getting Clara out. Marcus stepped out of the shadows. He slung a rifle over his shoulder. He grabbed a duffel bag from the dead guards. Clear, Marcus said. They moved fast. They left the alley. They piled into a waiting SUV. Marcus drove. He floored the gas pedal. They tore through the empty city streets. Julian slumped against the back seat. The pistol slipped from his fingers. It fell onto the floorboard. Clara looked at him. The dim streetlights flashed across his face. He was sweating heavily. He gritted his teeth. He pressed a hand to his side. Dark blood seeped through his black sweater. You tore your stitches, Clara said. Her voice was hollow. She was still in shock. It was a necessary risk. Julian muttered. He closed his eyes. Clara stared at him, the mafia boss, the killer. He had dragged himself out of a medical bed. He had risked a massive hemorrhage. He had walked into a gunfight. Just for her, her mentor had sold her to monsters. But the monster had come to save her. The world made no sense anymore. They reached the estate. Marcus carried Julian down to the underground bunker. He laid him on the hospital bed. "Get out," Clara told Marcus. Marcus looked at her. He didn't argue this time. He nodded and left the room. Clara stood over the bed. She looked at Julian. He was conscious, but he was in agony. She grabbed her medical shears. She cut the ruined sweater away. The sutures had burst. Fresh blood pooled in the depression of his stomach. She grabbed the sterile water. She grabbed the betadine. She grabbed the needle and thread. "I am not a prisoner anymore," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It echoed in the quiet room. Julian opened his eyes. He looked up at her. He didn't speak. "Arthur sold me to Silas." Her hands moved quickly. "She cleaned the wound. The man who taught me how to save lives sold mine to pay off a gambling debt. The system is broken. The law didn't protect me." She threaded the needle. She looked Julian right in the eye. "You saved me tonight," Clara continued. "You didn't have to. You could have stayed here. You could have let Silas take me. But you came. You are my doctor." Julian rasped, "I need you alive." "Don't lie to me," Clara snapped. She pushed the needle through his skin. Julian flinched, but she didn't stop. "You came because you know it was wrong. You came because somewhere inside that frozen heart, you know human beings are not property." Julian stared at her. The storm in his gray eyes settled. He didn't argue. "I am treating you right now," Clara said. She tied off the first stitch. "Not because Marcus has a gun. Not because you locked me in a room. I am doing this because I choose to. It is my choice, do you understand?" "I understand," Julian whispered. "We are making a deal," Clara said. She tied the second stitch. "I will keep you breathing. I will stitch every bullet hole they put in you. But you are going to destroy Silas. You are going to free those 40 women in Sector 4. You are going to burn the trafficking ring to the ground." "I will," Julian promised. It wasn't a mafia threat. It was a vow, Clara said. She finished the sutures. She applied a fresh bandage. She stepped back. The dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. She was no longer a hostage. She was a sovereign equal. She had chosen her path suddenly. A loud ringing sound shattered the quiet. Clara jumped. It was coming from the tactical duffel bag Marcus had tossed in the corner. The bag he took from the dead guards in the alley. Julian sat up slowly. He pointed to the bag. "Bring it." Clara walked over. She unzipped the canvas. She dug through spare magazines and flashlights. She found a heavy military-grade smartphone. The screen's glowing brightly. It was a video call. The caller ID was blocked. Clara carried the phone to the bed. Julian took it. He answered the call. He held the screen so Clara could see. A man appeared on the screen. He was older. He had silver hair and a sharp, cruel smile. He sat in a plush leather chair. He smoked a cigar as Thorn. "Hello, nephew," Silas said. His voice was smooth. It sounded like poisoned honey. "You look terrible. I hear you made a mess of my men in the alley tonight." "Your men were sloppy, Silas," Julian replied. His voice was ice. "Perhaps," Silas chuckled, "but I am a businessman. Julian, I always have leverage. I always have a backup plan." Silas turned his camera. The feed shifted. It showed a live feed from a different camera, a street camera. It was raining on the screen. A young woman was walking down a wet sidewalk. She wore a yellow raincoat. She carried a backpack. She looked exhausted. Clara stopped breathing. The floor dropped out from under her. It was her younger sister, Maya. She was in Seattle, 2,000 miles away. Clara gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Ah, Dr. Vance is there." Silas smiled off camera. "Your sister is walking home from her late shift at the library. It is very dark out there. Seattle is a dangerous city. So many shadows, so many places for a pretty girl to disappear. Don't you touch her." Clara screamed at the phone. "That depends entirely on Julian," Silas said smoothly. "The Sector 4 shipment moves tomorrow night. 40 prime units. If you try to stop my trucks, Julian, if you send your men. My men in Seattle will put Maya in the back of a van, and you know exactly where she will end up." Silas puffed his cigar. The smoke drifted across the lens. "Stand down, nephew. Let the shipment go. Or the doctor's little sister pays the toll. Have a good night." The screen went black. The bunker was silent. Clara stared at the blank phone. Her hands shook violently. A cold, absolute terror gripped her spine. She had just made a pact to save 40 strangers. And now, the price was her own sister's life. She fell to her knees. The weight of the world finally crushed her. The red emergency lights flared to life. The estate's alarm system didn't beep. It shrieked. It was a piercing, mechanical scream that vibrated in Clara's teeth. They breached the gates. Marcus's voice crackled over the intercom on the bunker wall. "Full tactical squad, heavy armor. They aren't trying to capture." They are trying to clear the board. Julian was already moving. He ripped the IV out of his arm. A drop of blood spilled onto the white sheets. He ignored it. He swung his legs over the bed. He grabbed a tactical vest from a chair and pulled it over his bandages. Silas isn't waiting for tomorrow night, Julian said. He grabbed an assault rifle from the weapons rack. He racked the slide. He knows I won't stand down. He's coming to finish the job. Clara stood up. Her terror for Maya was still there. It burned in her chest. But panic wouldn't save her sister. Action would. What do we do? Clara asked. She didn't cower. She reached for her heavy trauma bag. We moved to the armored SUV in the south garage. Julian ordered. We get out of the city. We regroup. Before he could take a step, the world ended. The explosion was deafening. It hit the eastern wall of the underground bunker. The shockwave picked Clara up and threw her across the room. She slammed into a steel cabinet. The breath exploded from her lungs. Concrete dusted the air. The heavy glass cabinets holding the medical supplies shattered into a million pieces. Vials of antibiotics, bags of saline, and blood packs exploded. They mixed with the debris on the floor. The bunker was instantly filled with thick, choking smoke, ears ringing. Clara pushed herself up. She coughed violently. She waved the dust away from her face. The wall was gone. A massive, gaping hole led out to the estate's lower gardens. Gunfire echoed from the lawn. Tracers lit up the night sky like deadly fireflies. Julie and Clara screamed over the ringing in her ears. She scrambled across the rubble. Julian was lying on his back near the ruined bed. A massive chunk of the ceiling had fallen next to him. The concussive force of the blast had hit him point blank. Clara fell to her knees beside him. He wasn't moving. His eyes were closed. His skin was gray. Clara pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery. Nothing. There was no pulse. The blast wave, the trauma, the massive blood loss from earlier. His weakened heart had simply stopped. He was in cardiac arrest. No, Clara gasped. No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to die. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the bullets flying through the gaping hole in the wall. She didn't think about Silas. She laced her fingers together. She placed the heel of her hand dead center on Julian's chest. She locked her elbows. She pushed. Hard, fast. 1, 2, 3, 4. She threw her entire body weight into the compressions. She had to manually pump the blood to his brain. She had to keep him alive. A bullet slammed into the metal bed frame inches from her head. Sparks showered over her arms. Clara didn't stop. She didn't duck. Come back, she screamed. She pressed her mouth to his. She forced 2 deep breaths of air into his lungs. She went back to compressions. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. She was sweating. Her arms burned with lactic acid. Dust coated her throat. Marcus. Clara shrieked between compressions. I need an AED. I need adrenaline. But all the supplies were destroyed. They were buried under tons of concrete. She had nothing but her own 2 hands. A shadow stepped through the hole in the wall, a mercenary in night vision goggles. He raised his rifle. He aimed it right at Clara's back. A 3-round burst tore through the smoke. The mercenary's head snapped back. He crumpled to the floor. Marcus stepped out of the stairwell. He held a smoking rifle. He took one look at Clara doing CPR. He didn't ask questions. He stepped in front of her. He became a human shield, firing out into the gardens to keep the kill squad back. Come on, Clara sobbed. She cracked a rib. She felt the bone give way under her hands. It was brutal. It was violent. But it was the only way. She paused. She checked the pulse. A faint, rapid flutter tapped against her fingers. His heart restarted, Julian gasped. His eyes flew open. He coughed violently, spitting dust and blood. Clara collapsed back onto her heels. She dragged a shaky hand through her hair. She was crying. She didn't even realize it. Julian grabbed her arm. He pulled himself up. He was running on pure, terrifying adrenaline. Move, Marcus roared over the gunfire. South garage now. Julian practically carried Clara up the stairs. They stumbled through the smoke-filled corridors of the estate. Paintings were on fire. Priceless vases were shattered. The empire was burning. They reached the steel doors of the south garage. Marcus punched in the code. The doors slid open. A massive, black-armored SUV sat waiting. The engine was already idling. Get in the back, Julian yelled. He shoved Clara toward the rear door. Marcus ran toward the driver's side. They were going to make it. They had survived the blast. They had a way out. Clara reached for the door handle. A high-pitched, screaming whistle cut through the air. It came from the tree line beyond the open garage doors. Julian reacted instantly. He tackled Clara to the concrete floor. He covered her body with his own. The rocket-propelled grenade hit the hood of the armored SUV. The explosion was apocalyptic. A massive fireball rolled over the garage ceiling. The concussive wave shattered every window in the vicinity. The heat was unbearable. It felt like opening an oven door. The SUV was instantly reduced to twisted, burning metal. Marcus was thrown backward into a tool chest. He didn't get up. Clara couldn't hear anything. Her ears were bleeding. Everything was moving in slow motion. Julian rolled off her. He dragged her behind a concrete pillar. The flames from the burning vehicle illuminated the driveway. Silas's mercenaries were advancing. They moved in a tactical line. They were closing in. There was no SUV. There was no escape. Julian leaned against the concrete pillar. He was out of breath. His skin was translucent. The adrenaline was failing. His body was shutting down. He reached into his tactical vest. He pulled out a sleek black 9mm handgun. He racked the slide. He grabbed Clara's hand. He pressed the cold metal grip into her palm. He folded her fingers over the gun. Clara stared at the weapon. Her hands shook violently. "Listen to me," Julian breathed. His voice was barely a whisper. "The woods behind the garage. There is a blind spot. Run." "No," Clara choked out. "We go together." Julian shook his head. He looked at the advancing shadows. "I can't run. I will slow you down. Silas wants me. He wants to watch me bleed." Julian looked back at her. His gray eyes were soft for the first time. There was no violence in them. "Only acceptance. Run, Clara," he whispered. "Use the gun. Save yourself. Save Maya. Tell the feds everything." He let go of her hands. He grabbed a spare rifle from the floor. He leaned around the pillar. He started firing at the mercenaries, drawing all their fire toward himself. Bullets chewed away the concrete around him. He was giving her a window. He was sacrificing himself so she could live. Clara looked at the gun in her hand. It was heavy. It was cold. It was the easy way out. She could run. She could disappear into the trees. She could save herself. But if she ran, if Julian died, Silas won. The women in Sector 4 would be sold. The cycle of human suffering would continue. She was a doctor. She took an oath to preserve life. She didn't run away when the alarms went off. Clara shoved the gun into the waistband of her slacks. She grabbed Julian by the collar of his tactical vest. She pulled him back behind the pillar with shocking force. Julian stumbled. He looked at her in shock. "What are you doing?" "I am not leaving my patient," Clara yelled over the gunfire. "Where do these tunnels go?" Julian stared at her. He saw the absolute, terrifying resolve in her eyes. The doctor was gone. The survivor had taken over. "The storm cellar," Julian rasped, pointing a shaky finger toward a heavy wooden door at the back of the garage. "Prohibition tunnels. They lead out to the aqueducts." "Cover us," Clara screamed to Marcus, who was groggily pulling himself up from the floor, blood pouring down his face. Marcus grunted. He propped his rifle on the hood of a classic car and unleashed a wall of suppressive fire. Clara threw Julian's arm over her shoulder. He was incredibly heavy, dead weight. But she found strength she didn't know she had. She dragged him across the garage. Bullets zipped past them. They sparked off the concrete floor. They hit the heavy wooden door. Julian kicked it open. They stumbled down a flight of steep stone stairs. The air instantly dropped 20 degrees. It smelled of mildew and old earth. Clara slammed the heavy door shut behind them. She threw the rusted iron deadbolt. It wouldn't hold them long, but it bought them time. They were in the tunnels. It was pitch black. The darkness was absolute. "Keep moving," Julian breathed. His voice echoed off the curved brick walls. They waded into the dark. The floor dipped, freezing. Waist-deep rainwater flooded the tunnel. The cold was a physical shock. It stole the breath from Clara's lungs. They pushed forward. The water sloshed against the brick. Every step was a battle against the freezing current. Julian's pace slowed. He was leaning heavily on Clara. His teeth were chattering violently. "Hypothermia," Clara muttered to herself. His body couldn't regulate its temperature. He had lost too much blood. His heart had stopped earlier. Now, the freezing water was draining the last bit of life from his cells. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed behind them. The cellar door had been breached. A bright beam of a tactical flashlight cut through the darkness. It swept across the brick ceiling. "They're in the water," a voice echoed down the tunnel. "Hide," Julian whispered. He tried to push Clara away. "Leave me." "Shut up," Clara hissed. She dragged him behind a thick brick support column that jutted out into the water. They pressed their backs against the cold, slimy stone. They were completely hidden from the main path. The flashlight beam bounced closer. The splashing footsteps grew louder. It was one man. He was moving fast, trying to catch up to them. Clara realized a terrifying truth. They couldn't outrun him. Julian was too weak. If the scout turned the corner, he would shoot them point blank. Julian reached for the gun Clara had tucked in her waistband. His hand was shaking so badly he couldn't grip the handle. He was useless. Clara looked at his shaking hand. She looked at the water. She made a choice. She reached into the pocket of her scrub jacket she still wore under her coat. Her fingers wrapped around a stainless steel surgical scalpel. She always carried one, a habit from the ER. The splashing stopped right on the other side of the brick column. The mercenary stepped around the corner. The flashlight blinded Clara. She didn't freeze. Clara lunged forward out of the water. She didn't know how to fight, but she knew anatomy. She knew the human body better than any soldier. She knew exactly where the arteries lived. She drove the scalpel directly into the side of the mercenary's neck, right into the carotid artery. It was a precise, devastating cut. The man dropped his rifle into the water. He made a wet, gurgling sound. His hands flew to his throat. He collapsed backward into the freezing water. The tunnel went dark again as the flashlight sank. Clara stood in the water. Her arm was suspended in the air. The bloody scalpel slipped from her trembling fingers. It splashed into the dark. She had just taken a human life. She was a healer. She was supposed to save people. A violent sob ripped from her throat. She fell back against the brick wall. Her knees buckled. Julian moved. He pushed through the water. He wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her against his chest. Julian whispered into her hair. "Clara, breathe, I killed him." Clara choked out. She was shaking uncontrollably. "I killed a man. You saved us." Julian said firmly. He held her tight. "He was a monster. You survived him." They stood in the freezing water for a long time. The silence in the tunnel was heavy. "We have to get out of the water," Clara finally whispered. Her teeth were chattering now. "Or we will freeze to death." They pushed forward. 100 yards later, the water receded. They climbed up a slight incline onto dry concrete. They collapsed against the wall. They were both shivering violently. Julian's lips were blue. His eyes were half closed. Clara said. She slapped his cheek lightly. "Stay awake," he mumbled. Clara knew the protocol for severe hypothermia. They had no blankets. They had no fire. They only had each other. "Take your clothes off," Clara ordered. Her fingers were numb, but she managed to unzip his heavy tactical vest. She pulled the soaked, freezing sweater over his head. She stripped him down to his waist. She did the same. She took off her ruined coat. She took off her soaked scrub jacket. She pressed her bare chest against his bare skin. Skin-to-skin contact. It was the only way to transfer core body heat. She wrapped her arms around his back. She buried her face in the crook of his neck. Julian gasped at the contact. His arms instinctively wrapped around her waist. He pulled her closer. They lay there on the cold concrete. Two enemies, two survivors. Stripped of all their armor. Stripped of their titles. They were just two human beings trying to keep each other warm in the dark. "Why did you stay?" Julian whispered. His breath ghosted across her collarbone. "Because a life is a life." Clara murmured, holding him tighter. "And yours is worth saving." Julian closed his eyes. In the freezing dark, he finally believed her. Hours passed. The shivering slowly stopped. Their shared body heat stabilized them. Morning light suddenly pierced the darkness. They had reached the end of the tunnel. An iron grate looked out over the concrete banks of the Chicago aqueduct. The storm had passed. The sun was rising. Julian sat up. He looked better. The color was returning to his face. He reached into a waterproof pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, encrypted radio. He keyed the mic. "Marcus, are you alive?" Static hissed. Then a rough voice replied. "Alive, boss, barely. The estate is gone." Silas's men fell back when the cops showed up. "We need extraction," Julian said. "We are at the North Aqueduct Grate." "I can't get to you, boss," Marcus said. His voice was grim. Silas used his political leverage. He called in a terror threat. "The mayor locked down the city. Every bridge is blocked. Every port is closed. They are searching cars at the city limits." Julian lowered the radio. He looked at Clara. They had survived the night. But they were trapped in a city controlled by a man who wanted them both dead. And the women in Sector 4 were running out of time. They made it to a downtown safe house. It was a sterile, high-rise apartment. It belonged to a shell company. It was off the books. Marcus was waiting for them. He had a fresh change of clothes. He had a medical kit. He had weapons. Julian sat heavily on a leather sofa. He looked drained. The color had completely vanished from his face. Clara went straight to work. She cleaned his torn stitches. She applied fresh bandages. She hooked him up to a bag of eye fluids. She worked in silence. The air in the room was heavy. Julian reached into his jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table. "Take it," Julian said. Clara looked at the envelope. "What is that? A new passport. A new name. Bank details for an offshore account." Julian listed smoothly. "There is $5 million in that account. Marcus has a car waiting downstairs. It will take you to a private airstrip. I have a Gulfstream fueled and ready. You are going to Costa Rica." Clara stopped wrapping the bandage. She stared at him. "No, this is not a debate." "Clara," Julian said. His voice was hard. It was the voice of the mafia boss. "Silas knows who you are. He threatened your sister. As long as you are near me, you are a target. You are leaving. Tonight you are sending me away." Clara asked. Her voice shook. "After everything we just survived." "I am saving you," Julian corrected. He looked away from her. He stared out the window at the city lights. "I brought you into this nightmare. I am getting you out. You did your job. My debt is paid. Now go." Clara felt a sharp ache in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was rejection. She had seen the man beneath the monster. She had shared his breath in the freezing dark, but he was right. She was a doctor. She didn't belong in a war. And she had to protect Maya. Clara picked up the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy. "If you die," Clara whispered. "If Silas wins, I will never forgive you." Julian finally looked at her. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I don't plan on dying today." Dr. Marcus escorted her down to the underground garage. He opened the door of a black sedan. Clara climbed in. She didn't look back. The drive to the airstrip was a blur. The rain had stopped. The city streets gleamed with wet asphalt. Clara held the envelope tight against her chest. She was going to be rich. She was going to be safe. She could fly Maya out to join her. They reached the private tarmac. A sleek white Gulfstream jet sat waiting. The stairs were down. Clara walked up the steps. She stepped into the cabin. It was pure luxury, cream leather seats, polished wood, soft lighting. A flight attendant smiled at her. "Welcome aboard, Miss Vance. Please take a seat. We are cleared for immediate takeoff." Clara sank into a plush leather chair. She buckled her seatbelt. The cabin door closed, the heavy seal locked into place. The engines whined to life. The plane began to taxi down the runway. Clara closed her eyes. She let out a long, shuddering breath. It was over. She had survived. The nightmare was finally behind her. "Excuse me," a voice said. Clara opened her eyes. The co-pilot stood in the aisle. He held a clipboard. He reached up to adjust an overhead bin. His sleeve slipped up his wrist. Clara stopped breathing. A black tattoo was inked into his skin. A serpent wrapping around a dagger. The mark of Silas Thorne's personal guard. The co-pilot looked down at her. He didn't smile. He turned around. He walked back to the cockpit. He stepped inside. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut. A loud electronic click echoed through the cabin. The deadbolt engaged. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Silas hadn't let her go. He owned the airstrip. He owned the crew. Julian had tried to save her. But he had walked her right into a trap. The plane turned onto the main runway. The engines roared. The thrust pushed Clara back into her seat. They were picking up speed. If this plane took off, she was dead. Silas would torture her for Julian's location. Then he would kill her. Clara didn't panic. She didn't scream. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She reached down into her leather boot. She pulled out a small plastic syringe. She had filled it with a massive dose of a paralytic sedative at the safe house. She always kept a backup plan. She stood up. The plane was hurtling down the tarmac. The cabin shook. She staggered down the aisle. She grabbed the red emergency fire axe mounted on the wall. The flight attendant screamed. "What are you doing? Sit down." Clara ignored her. She swung the heavy axe. She smashed the blade into the electronic lock of the cockpit door. Sparks flew, the metal crunched. She swung again. The locking mechanism shattered. Clara kicked the door open. The cockpit was a mess of glowing dials and screens. The pilot and co-pilot spun around in their seats. "Hey!" the co-pilot yelled. He reached for a gun on his hip. Clara was faster. She lunged forward. She drove the needle directly into the side of the co-pilot's neck. She pushed the plunger down. The man gasped. His eyes rolled back. The paralytic hit his bloodstream instantly. He slumped over the center console. His heavy body slammed into the throttle controls. The plane jerked violently. The engine screamed. The aircraft veered sharply to the right. "Pull up," the pilot panicked. He wrestled with the yoke. The plane skidded off the center line. It tore across the wet concrete. It was barreling completely out of control. Clara grabbed the back of the pilot's seat. She braced for impact. Suddenly, a massive shape exploded through the airport's chain-link perimeter fence. It was a black armored SUV. It tore across the grass. It skidded onto the tarmac. The SUV drifted violently. It slammed its side directly into the path of the aircraft's landing gear. The impact was catastrophic. The plane's wheels sheared off. The nose dropped. The belly of the jet slammed into the concrete in a shower of brilliant orange sparks. The aircraft ground to a violent, screeching halt. Smoke filled the cabin. Emergency alarms blared. Clara coughed. She uncurled from the floor. She was bruised. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but she was alive. The emergency exit door was ripped open from the outside. Julian stood on the tarmac. The wreckage of the SUV smoked behind him. He looked like a demon rising from the ashes. His eyes were wide with terror. He expected to find a victim. He expected to find a tragedy. Clara stepped into the doorway. She looked down at him. She held her medical bag in one hand. She wiped the blood from her face with the other. "I told you," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I am not leaving." Julian stared at her. He didn't speak. He reached up. He grabbed her waist and lifted her down from the burning wreckage. Marcus ran up beside them. He held an assault rifle. He looked at the smoking plane. He looked at Clara. He shook his head in disbelief. "We are out of time," Julian said. His voice was cold again. The terrifying focus of the apex predator had returned. "Silas knows the plane crashed. He will accelerate the shipment. We move now." They piled into a secondary vehicle Marcus had stashed outside the fence. They drove toward the Chicago shipping yards. Sector 4, the rain started again. It was a freezing drizzle that matched the cold dread in Clara's stomach. She opened her medical bag in the back seat. She sorted her supplies. She prepared syringes. She counted bandages. "You stay in the car," Julian ordered. He looked at her through the rearview mirror. "No," Clara said. She didn't look up. She kept sorting her gear. "You need a distraction to breach the main gate. Silas has 30 armed guards. If you walk up there, they will cut you down. You need a ghost." Julian turned in his seat. He glared at her. "I am not using you as bait." "I am a doctor," Clara said. She looked him dead in the eye. "I have clearance. I have a medical badge. I am a civilian." They will hesitate. That hesitation is your window. "Do you want to save those women or not?" Julian's jaw clenched. He hated it. But he knew she was right. They parked 3 blocks from the shipyard. The massive rusted metal gates of Sector 4 loomed in the fog. Searchlights swept the wet pavement. Clara stepped out of the car. She put on her white coat over her clothes. She clipped her hospital badge to her lapel. She grabbed her trauma bag. She walked down the middle of the street, straight toward the gate. "Stop right there," a guard shouted from the guardhouse. He raised a rifle. Clara kept walking. She held her hands up. She looked terrified. She played the part perfectly. "Please," Clara cried out. "I'm a doctor." There was an accident on the highway. A pileup. "I need to use your phone. My cell is dead. People are dying out there." The guards hesitated. They were killers. But they weren't expecting a crying woman in a lab coat. 3 guards stepped out of the gate. They lowered their weapons slightly. They approached her. "Listen, lady," the lead guard growled. "You can't be here. This is private property." "Please," Clara begged. She stepped closer. She drew their attention entirely to her. "You have to help me." That was the window. Shadows moved in the fog. Julian and Marcus struck with lethal, terrifying silence. They didn't use guns. They used knives. They dropped from the top of the shipping containers. They neutralized the 3 guards in a matter of seconds. It was brutal. It was efficient. It was completely silent. Clara didn't flinch. She watched the men fall. She stepped over them. "The main warehouse," Julian whispered. He pointed to a massive corrugated steel building at the end of the pier. "That is where the containers are." They moved through the maze of metal boxes. The warehouse doors were cracked open. Inside, harsh halogen lights illuminated the massive space. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the room. He wore an expensive tailored suit. He was smoking a cigar. A dozen armed mercenaries surrounded him. Behind them sat 2 massive steel shipping containers. The doors were locked from the outside. Muffled cries echoed from within the metal walls. 40 human beings, treated like cargo. Clara felt a sickening rage burn in her chest. "Take the high ground," Julian whispered to Marcus. "Eliminate the guards. Leave Silas to me." Marcus nodded. He vanished up a steel ladder into the rafters. Julian stepped out of the shadows. He walked straight into the light. "Silas." Julian's voice echoed through the massive warehouse like thunder. The mercenaries spun around. They raised their rifles. Silas laughed. It was a cruel, scratching sound. Julian, you just don't know when to die. Kill him. The mercenaries never got the chance to pull their triggers. Marcus opened fire from the rafters. His shots were devastatingly accurate. He dropped 6 men in the first 3 seconds. Chaos erupted. Gunfire deafened the room. Julian didn't take cover. He moved forward. He was a force of nature. He fired his pistol with terrifying precision. Every shot found a target. He moved through the crossfire as if the bullets couldn't touch him. He was fighting for his empire. But more than that, he was fighting for the women in those boxes. Within a minute, the warehouse was quiet. The mercenaries were dead. Silas backed up against one of the shipping containers. His cigar fell from his mouth. His face was pale. He reached for a gold-plated pistol in his shoulder holster. Julian was faster. He kicked the gun out of Silas's hand. Julian grabbed his uncle by the throat. He slammed the older man against the corrugated steel wall. Julian, Silas choked. He raised his hands in surrender. Wait, we can make a deal. I have offshore accounts. I can give you millions. You can buy politicians. You can buy police. Clara stepped out from the shadows. She walked up behind Julian. She looked at Silas. She looked at the padlock on the container door. Human lives are not for sale. Clara, her voice was clear and absolute. It rang out in the quiet warehouse. They are not commodities. They are not cargo. Every person in that box has a right to their own life. You do not own them, Silas sneered at her. You are just a doctor. You don't understand the world. She understands it perfectly, Julian said. He didn't hand Silas over to the police. The police were corrupt. The system was broken. This was the underworld, and in the underworld, the king makes the law. My empire is clean. Silas, Julian whispered. The trafficking ends tonight. Julian raised his pistol. He placed the barrel against his uncle's chest. He pulled the trigger once. Silas slumped to the concrete floor. The monster was dead. Marcus climbed down from the rafters. He walked over to the shipping containers. He raised his rifle and shot the heavy brass padlocks off the doors. He swung the heavy metal doors open. Dozens of terrified, exhausted women peered out into the light. They were freezing. They were crying. Clara rushed forward. She dropped her bag. She didn't see victims. She saw survivors. It's okay, Clara said softly, holding her hands out. You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you. Julian stood back. He watched Clara comfort the women. He watched her bring light into the darkest corner of his world. Suddenly, his knees buckled. The adrenaline completely abandoned him. His torn stitches gave way. The blood loss caught up to him. Julian collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. The world faded to black. 6 months later, the emergency room at Chicago Mercy Hospital was quiet. It was a rare, peaceful Tuesday morning. The flickering fluorescent lights were gone. The cracked linoleum was replaced. The trauma bays were stocked with state-of-the-art medical equipment. The hospital had received an anonymous $5 million donation. Clara Vance stood at the nurse's station. She signed a stack of digital charts. She wore a crisp white coat. A new badge was clipped to her lapel. Dr. Clara Vance, Chief of Surgery. She had used the money Julian gave her, not to run away, but to buy out Arthur Pendleton. She had forced the corrupt doctor to resign in disgrace. She had taken control of her hospital. She had taken control of her life. She was not a victim, she was a sovereign equal. She chose this life on her own terms. The automatic doors of the ambulance bay slid open silently. Clara looked up. Julian Thorne walked into the emergency room. He didn't bring chaos this time. He didn't bring armed guards. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He leaned slightly on a silver-handled cane. The physical scars of that night were permanent. He looked healthy. He looked powerful, and he looked directly at her. Clara smiled. She handed the tablet to a nurse. She walked across the pristine lobby to meet him. Mr. Thorne, Clara said. Her tone was professional, but a warm light danced in her eyes. You don't have an appointment. I prefer walk-ins, doctor, Julian replied. His low, gravelly voice sent a familiar shiver down her spine. How is the pain? She asked. Glancing at the cane, manageable, he said. He stepped closer. The distance between them evaporated. The syndicate is quiet. The shipping routes are legitimate. The politicians are terrified of me. But I find myself incredibly bored. You should take up a hobby, Clara suggested, Julian murmured. He reached out. His fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was warm. It was reverent. I have been funding safe houses for women across the state. Clara's heart swelled. He hadn't just stopped the trafficking. He was actively repairing the damage. He was using his power to empower others. You learned something from me after all, Clara whispered. I learned everything from you, Julian said. He didn't try to control her. He didn't try to lock her in a gilded cage. He knew that true power was not about forcing someone to stay. True power was giving them the freedom to leave, and watching them choose to stand by your side. Your shift is over, Julian noted, glancing at the clock on the wall. It is, Clara agreed. Julian dropped his cane. It clattered against the clean floor. He wrapped his arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest. He didn't care about the nurses watching. He didn't care about the cameras. He kissed her. It was deep, consuming kiss. It tasted of survival. It tasted of absolute devotion. Clacker wrapped her arms around his neck. She kissed him back with equal fierce intensity. She had stitched the mafia boss's wound in a dirty trauma bay. She had fought his wars in the dark. She didn't let the darkness break her. She conquered it. And in return, the most dangerous man in Chicago had laid his entire empire at her feet. Julian pulled back slightly. He rested his forehead against hers. Let's go home, Clara, he whispered. Yes, she said, let's go home. They walked out of the hospital together. The glass doors slid shut behind them. The sun was shining brightly over Chicago. The shadows were finally gone. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality. And so as Clara and Julian walked out of the hospital beneath the bright Chicago sun, their story left behind something far more powerful than the memory of gunfire, betrayal, and survival. It reminded us that the greatest battles are not always fought with weapons. Sometimes they are fought with a steady voice in a room filled with fear. Sometimes they are fought by refusing to look away when another human being is treated as less than human. And sometimes they are fought through one simple but courageous word: no. Clara's greatest strength was never her ability to stitch a wound, restart a heart, or remain calm while the world collapsed around her. Her greatest strength was her unshakable belief that every person has value. From the homeless man lying on her operating table to the dangerous mafia boss bleeding in her trauma bay, Clara refused to measure the worth of a life by money, power, status, or reputation. To her, a life was a life. That belief placed her in danger. But it also became the light that guided Julian out of the darkness. Julian began this story as a man who believed control was necessary for survival. He used locked doors, armed guards, threats, and fear, because those were the only languages his world had ever taught him. Yet Clara forced him to confront a truth no weapon could silence. Protecting someone does not give you the right to own them. Love without freedoms is not love. Safety without consent is only another kind of prison. Real devotion does not demand obedience. It offers respect, equality, and the freedom to choose. Clara did not change Julian by becoming weaker for him. She changed him by standing firmly beside him as his equal. She challenged him when he was wrong. She saved him when he was broken. And when she finally chose to remain, it mattered because the choice belonged entirely to her. That is one of the most important lessons this story gives us. A person who has been controlled, betrayed, or frightened does not need another powerful figure to decide their future. They need their voice returned to them. They need the right to say yes, the right to say no, and the right to walk away without fear. Clara's courage was not the absence of terror. She was afraid many times. She trembled, she cried, and she doubted the world she had once trusted. But courage is not about feeling nothing. Courage is choosing what is right, even when fear is screaming at you to surrender. She escaped when her freedom was stolen. She returned when innocent lives were at stake. She confronted corruption in the hospital, cruelty in the underworld, and violence within herself. Each time she refused to let darkness decide who she would become. Julian's journey teaches us something equally important. Redemption is not created by promises. It is created by action. Saying that you have changed means very little if the people you once harmed remain trapped by your power. Julian did not earn redemption simply because he loved Clara. He began earning it when he ended the trafficking routes, freed the women imprisoned in the shipping containers, funded safe houses, and transformed the empire that had profited from suffering. True change requires sacrifice. It requires accountability. It requires using power not to dominate the vulnerable, but to protect their freedom. The story also warns us that evil does not always look like a monster standing in the shadows. Sometimes it wears a respectable face. Arthur was a doctor, a mentor, and a trusted father figure, yet fear and greed led him to betray Clara. Julian was feared as a criminal, yet he risked his own life to save her. This does not mean that violence becomes good or that crime becomes noble. It means that appearances alone cannot reveal the truth of a person's character. Character is revealed by choices, especially the choices made when there is something to lose. In the end, Clara did not conquer darkness by becoming part of it. She conquered it by carrying her humanity through it. She proved that compassion is not weakness, that dignity is not a privilege reserved for the powerful, and that one determined person can force even the darkest empire to change. Julian may have saved Clara from the men in the alley, but Clara saved Julian from becoming the same kind of monster he was fighting. They saved each other in different ways. And perhaps that is what real love should be, not one person rescuing another and demanding loyalty in return, but two people helping each other become freer, stronger, and more human. So as we leave Clara and Julian beneath that Chicago sunlight, let us remember this: no human being is property. No amount of wealth, fear, or authority gives someone the right to steal another person's freedom. Our lives belong to us. Our voices matter. Our choices matter. And even after betrayal, violence, and darkness, it is still possible to build something better, not through control, but through courage, accountability, and respect. Because the most powerful love is not the love that says, "You belong to me." It is the love that says, "You belong to yourself, and I am grateful that you chose to stand beside me." If Clara and Julian's journey touched your heart, remember to subscribe and join us for more stories of dangerous men, fearless women, impossible choices, and the kind of love powerful enough to bring light into even the darkest empire.